Hello and welcome to Conversations with Sakina Datoo. My guest today is Sabira Lakha. She is a parliamentary candidate for Harrow East and standing as an independent candidate. Thank you very much, Sabira, for joining me today.
Sakina, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to talk about my candidacy. Thank you.
So let's start right from the beginning, Sabira. You are standing as a parliamentary candidate for Harrow East. People first want to know who is Sabira Lakha? You know, where did you come from? What's your background? Tell us a little bit about your background.
So I am a daughter of Murtaza and Fatima Lakha, and I have two brothers, Shabir and Glambas, and I'm the middle born. We were born. I was born in Mombasa, Kenya, and because my mom is from Kenya, the tradition was that the daughter goes home to have the child. So I was born in Kenya, but my father is from Zanzibar, and then after the Zanzibar Revolution, he migrated to Dar es Salaam in Tanzania, and so that's where I was brought up. My brothers and I went to international school in Dar es Salaam, and that was home for 17 years of my life.
That's really interesting because, I'm obviously from Tanzania too. And I think, when we look back, we realize there's a lot of values that have become us, that were given to us at that time. You know, growing up in an East African country where, for example, there was a mixed cultural environment where people lived without really noticing, what race were you, what color were you. They are the values that were embedded in us. How much of who you are today came from that environment?
I would say a lot of me is because of that environment. First and foremost, the value that was most embedded in me and my brothers was that of service. Service without payment, voluntary service. And that was very much key in our home. My parents did a lot of voluntary service, my grandparents did, my aunts and uncles did, my cousins did. So it was very much assumed that that is something we would do. It was not something we thought about or had a choice about. It was community service, voluntary work was embedded in us. And you see that in all cultures. It's not a prerogative of us East African Asians. We are a Gujarati community, and it's not our prerogative only. Seva, khidmat, service, these are all terms that are used in many ethnic communities and Caucasian communities. It's not a prerogative of people of faith or non-faith. It's humanity. We as human beings are inherently, we've got a conscience that tells us to serve. It's embedded in us.
Now, when you talk about the Gujarati streak in us, the Gujaratis generally are known as people who are very business-oriented community.
Yes.
When you grow up, your first thoughts are towards making money, being successful. Why politics? Politics is not a mainstay of Gujaratis.
Well, politics overlaps everything. There's nothing that is not affected by politics. Even the economic policies that Gujaratis are very interested in, stems from the political perspective one has. There is no aspect of society that is not impacted by politics. The laws that are passed, how laws are interpreted, we now understand how the judiciary works and who is in the judiciary impacts on the kind of laws and how they get interpreted, what sentences are given out. There's a sentencing bracket, but how that is used is dependent on politics. So it would be very naive to say, oh, well, I don't do politics. Everybody does politics. Question is, do you do politics with a big P or a small p? But everybody does politics, because politics is essentially about the governance of society. How you operate, how you function, how you set up and establish a society is what politics is about. It isn't just about parliamentary debates. It isn't about just Parliament, Prime Minister's question time. It is about what values we consider to be important in society, how we engage with each other, how we set up our society, what institutions we put in place.
So if we back up a little bit, your childhood was in Tanzania, as we spoke. Yes. When did you come to the UK, and what educational qualifications have you attained?
So we landed on the 13th of July on a Wednesday, wow. 1988. And we chose to come here. My parents have always led a very democratic family. They believed in us taking responsibility for the decisions we make. They taught us to make informed choices. And even when it came to migrating to this country, we had a discussion. My father was a barrister, and therefore they were English-trained barrister, and therefore with his English qualifications, there were a number of countries he could have practiced in. So we looked at where he could practice without having to sit for further exams, and where he could pick up the business quickly, because even the law, being a solicitor, being a barrister, being a doctor, it's all business at the end of the day. It's service-based, but it's still a business because you're still earning to keep your family, to sustain the family. And we had to make a choice. And it gave us an opportunity to lobby each other as to where we wanted to migrate and why. We were given an opportunity to express that at the dinner table. The dinner table conversations were very much part of our family life and still is, which is why we miss Daddy so much, because he really did encourage free thinking. And my mom played a very big role in that, because whilst Mummy didn't have the opportunity to go to university as I did, she is a highly informed lady, very well read, and superbly intelligent. So I'm very fortunate to have had the parents I did. And my brothers are very, very supportive. There's absolutely no way I could stand for parliamentary elections without the support of my brothers and my sister-in-law. And family is important. How big, how small, doesn't matter. Family is really, really important, because we get our inner strength from family, and we get our inner strength from very close friends. Had it not been for the encouragement and motivation of my very dear close friends, I wouldn't be sitting here with you today.
I want to come to your educational qualification, but you've mentioned family.
Yes.
Let's talk about that.
Okay.
You know, family is getting eroded, especially in the environment we live in at the moment. And we know that that's very detrimental, especially, you know, given the background we're talking about, the
Yes.
backgrounds we came from.
Yes.
If you were to succeed, how would you help the issue of, you know, the breakdown of families that's going on?
One of the reasons, not the only, finance is a huge reason why families break down. We know statistically a lot of divorces take place because of financial burdens. The financial stress and strains in a family, people are not able to sustain a marriage, not because they don't love each other, not because there isn't the care, but that's because the burden of financial pressures are such that it cracks the marriage. There's just so much a human being can take. And if we want to keep the family unit sustainable, we need to look at other issues that causes the breakdown of family. Because we know that when a family breaks down, it doesn't just affect the husband and wife. There are the children, the extended family, even the neighborhood, even friends, even the friends of the couple are affected. It's imperative to sustain the family unit in our societies. One of the ways we could do that is by looking at the cost of living crisis. The other thing we can look at is housing. When councils allow for two-story developments, permitted development, what it does is that it allows for the families to extend the house, to allow multi-generational living. Now, multi-generational living, we Asians know that very well, but it's becoming more and more common in Britain for multi-generational living, partly because there just isn't the stock of good houses at the moment. And when you do find a house, they usually cost a lot. It's far more effective with the utility bills as they are now to have a multi-story house for multi-generational living. And you can have the grandparents, you can have the children and the grandchildren all living together. The benefit in that is that you don't then have to look for babysitters outside the house. Having grandparents around the table for the children lends them additional emotional support that the parents are not able to give. Parents will often complain about how their parents are so different with their children, because grandparents are different with children.
Yeah, but not everybody wants to live in that kind of an environment. And we know, you know, we're talking of Harrow East in particular. There are many young people who would, you know, aspire that they would reach a stage whereby they'd be able to move out of their homes. They would be able to, you know, own a house. And today, the young people, one of the major problems facing us in this country is that young people are not able to, you know, buy houses, put down deposits. So, I mean, what would you say to that group of people?
So, for instance, you'll see from my campaign material, one of the things that I'm proposing is that the first-time buyer scheme should be relaxed a little bit more, so that more young people, young couples are able to benefit from that scheme. The rules are so strict at the moment that a lot of people are not included. I think we should also consider having preferential mortgage rates for first time, up to a point of 6 years, because then it's not fair on the rest of the economy. And even if they were to give preferential mortgage rates for the young, the banks would still make a profit. And they would make a less of a profit, but they would still make a profit. And it's really important that young people are on the housing ladder. They start becoming independent adults and start having their own families. But before they do that, if they lived at home with one set of the parents, it would give them a chance to save up on the deposit. So having relaxed planning for houses is really important.
Okay, let's back up again to your educational qualifications. Okay. Tell us what is your qualification, what you've done so far, before you've embarked on this journey.
So I'll talk about what's relevant to what I'm doing, because I have a tendency of accumulating qualifications. My first degree was in politics and international studies because I have a passion in that subject. I love to understand how societies govern and how they're set up. And a lot of the political science degrees, are composed of philosophy. And that was thrilling, to read different philosophies and study them. And having the privilege to talk to professors on it, I felt very at home there. That was at Warwick University. I also then pursued a master's in law, in international law and human rights. I come from East Africa. Human rights was a hot topic. I grew up at the time when South Africa was under the apartheid regime. We all were anti-apartheid campaigners in our own way. And it was something that always took my imagination as to how is it that we have inherent rights, we have inalienable rights, and yet they're not so. And yet the rights we have very much depend on which family you're born into, which country you're born into, which era you're born into. And it raised that curiosity in me to study more about why is it that human rights are not universal, despite the UN declaration.
That's a very interesting topic for you to talk about in the present scenario, because
Yes,
yes, I remember us being in the forefront of activism during the South African apartheid. But there's another apartheid going on today, and unprecedented amount of pain, and the visions that we see coming out of Gaza. And yet, this is our country where our politicians are complicit in the genocide. They are sending arms to kill babies, to behead and burn our babies, You want to go into the same parliament and work with the government. How will you work to change the situation in Gaza?
that's a very poignant question, and it's a very heavy burden on any parliamentarian today. What is happening is unacceptable, not because of nationality, not because of religions, but basic humanity. Basic humanity. It really doesn't matter which creed, culture, faith you fit into. We're human beings. And to watch human beings treated in that manner, where they're dehumanized, where they are stripped of all self-respect and dignity, it's difficult to watch, very difficult to watch. This brings me very well into what I would like to talk about, and that is that there's a lot of myth about voting for an independent resulting in a wasted vote. And to an extent, one could argue that the two political parties have colonized our minds as voters to vehemently believe, it's entrenched in our thought, that voting for anything other than a Tory or Labour is a wasted vote. It doesn't matter, because where are the independents going to sit? They're going to sit on the sidelines. Well, most of the party parliamentarians are sitting on the back benches. They don't have a say. They don't have any more voting power than an independent would. But think about it this way. Arguably, had there been more independents in Parliament, had parties had a lesser majority and not been so strong, they would have been forced to collaborate with the independents. The independents are the conscious vote. The independents are people who have the freedom to choose what their policies are going to be. They are not chained by political parties and political manifestos. So they're very much people who care about the local community at a conscious level, not simply economic and social. Now, had the ceasefire vote taken place at a time when there'd been more members of parliament who were independent, what would have happened is that they would have been able to speak up in support of the SNP because they would have been free to do so. They were undoubtedly both Tory and Labour backbenchers who would have wanted to support the ceasefire motion, but they couldn't because they were chained by the political parties. The independents would be unchained. They would be free. They will be liberated to speak the truth, speak by human consciousness. So when the Labour Party and the Labour leader sabotaged, and I would like to use that word, when he sabotaged the ceasefire motion proposed by the SNP unconstitutionally, unprecedented, of course, aided and abetted by the Tory party, what happened was there was nobody there in Parliament to support the SNP. And there wasn't enough support there to speak up, to say, no, we want a debate. And at the very least, there should have been a debate on the ceasefire motion.
Absolutely. And, we're talking about the Tory and the Labour. Now, if we zoom in into your area, Harrow East, I think, in terms of the Tories, I don't think there's anyone who supports them anymore or understands that this is a party that is completely complicit in the genocide in Gaza. But apart from Gaza, of course, they've not been good for the country too, and they've taken us to doldrums. However, there's still a lot of misconceptions in people who think that Labour will provide a better, options. Now, of course, we know Keir Starmer, very strongly pro-genocidal. But also, if we look at your own candidates in Harrow East, the two, members of Parliament, prospective candidates from the Tory party and the Labour Party, are both part of Friends of Israel.
The two parties, unfortunately, now are two sides of the same coin. And we're not just talking about their complicitness in the genocide or aiding and abetting that by selling arms, by not calling for an immediate unconditional ceasefire, by not respecting the ICJ ruling. And that's what annoys me the most, that we promote and preach to the rest of the world on how these democratic institutions should be respected. We go to Africa and tell Africa about democracy. We tell them about human rights. We tell them about the rule of law. Of all things, we preach to the outside world about the rule of law. But when the ICJ passes a ruling that doesn't suit our political elite, we drop it just like that. Suddenly, rule of law doesn't matter. And with what face are we then proselytizing the rule of law to the international world? I don't think the Tory party can ever wash their hands of having failed to respect the integrity of the international legal structure. And I don't think that the political elite of today have any face left in preaching to the world in how they should be upholding human rights. I think we need to have a new set of political leaders. The political elite, the political establishment are tarnished, not just with their lack of calling for a ceasefire and for selling arms to encourage the current atrocities. And whilst they may deny that they don't encourage it, by selling arms, that's what they're doing. They're aiding and abetting the war environment and the war industry. More importantly, if we don't change the political elite of today, then what we're doing is we are perpetuating the corruption that's eroding Britain. I'm not standing as a parliamentarian for Israel or Palestine. I'm standing as a parliamentarian candidate for Britain. This is my country. I've chosen this place to be my home. This was not somewhere I was born. This is somewhere I've chosen to make home. And that is a fundamental distinction. This is my choice for this place to be my home. And if I've chosen Britain to be my home, I want Britain to be a beautiful place to live in. I want Britain to be a place to live in where it's upholding the values that I was brought up with.
And I think this is the misconception, Sabira, especially I think when you are seen as a Muslim candidate, and there is this misconception that, when we speak of Gaza in particular, that, we are not loyal to Britain, that we are only thinking about the Muslim countries, when in reality, as British citizens, We actually want moral politics for our country. And therefore, do you find this imposter syndrome coming in as a Muslim candidate who people probably think you're just trying to get the Muslim vote?
Yes, absolutely. I do feel that I could be accused of that. And if you look at all my publications on Instagram, you'll very quickly discover that I'm a candidate that believes in wanting Britain to be seen as a champion of international law, to be seen as a champion of human rights, because those are inherently British values.
Absolutely, absolutely. Now, tell us why at this particular time you've decided to go into politics, because you're a lawyer by profession,
I'm an adjudicator.
adjudicator,
I'm an
and
adjudicator, yes.
And now you've decided to embark on this political. Why now? Why particularly now?
It's a culmination of a few things. Before the genocide occurred, I was quite disturbed by the level of corruption that takes place with impunity, absolute, downright, shameless corruption, where we saw during COVID when friends, families, neighbors were struggling in hospitals, when children were not able to be at the deathbed of their parents, parents were not able to be there for their children in hospital. And we saw that the government, the political elite, not the government, but the political elite, were dishing out contracts in the thousands like Smarties. It wasn't their money to dish out like that. They were irresponsible, negligent, and they downright had total disregard for the British people. When people were dying in hospitals, when they didn't have enough protection material, what is called the PPE, they didn't have the nurses were serving COVID-infected patients without having proper protection, and they were vulnerable to catching the illness themselves. There was no regard for that. There was complete denial that this money was should have been used for the NHS and to protect our doctors and our staff and our nurses and our carers. Instead, they blew it. They blew it on fake contracts, even if they had given their contracts to friends and family, and that resulted in protection materials like gloves and masks and the full protection gowns. If it had resulted in that being delivered to the NHS staff, I would have felt, well, okay, at least they got the protection. Okay, it cost more than it should have done, but at least in the end they were protected. But what is absolutely disgraceful and diabolical is that we paid millions out for no delivery at all.
The Tories.
Absolutely. But then where was Labour calling out for that? Where was if Labour's job at the time was to be an effective opposition, Labour was supposed to protect us. That is the job of the opposition, so that we don't have the complete concentration of power on the government. So the whole point of the opposition is to have the checks and balances of power, so that you don't have an elected dictatorship. By the opposition being so weak or indirectly complicit in what was going on, by becoming an ineffective opposition, Labour allowed the Tories to be elected dictators.
So did you start thinking about politics at that stage then?
I did start thinking about where this country was going and my responsibility to it, very much so, yes. And then what happened was, of course, you think about these things and ideas come to mind and you think that you have a responsibility, and then life happens. But then when Gaza took place and the atrocities happened, as we witnessed, a group of my friends and we were talking about who are we going to vote for? Elections will come up because we have a 5-year term now. So at some point, an election will be called. And should it be called, who would we vote for? We can't vote Tory and we can't vote Labour. And Lib Dem isn't much better either, because they didn't call for an unconditional ceasefire. So, and you see the literature, it's not aligned with those values. So you now wonder, who do you vote for? The political elite is a complete vacuum. They're morally bankrupt. And therefore, we then started thinking about the fact that we needed to put up a candidate who would be an alternative, not a competitor, but an alternative. And what I provide is a completely alternative set of values that you'd be voting for.
Final question, Sabira. We are running out of time. Just the very final question. I see that your campaign is mostly geared towards justice. You talk about justice all in your pamphlets and everywhere. In very few words, tell us, what justice means to you and why should people vote for you?
Well, what justice really means is that everybody should have an equal share, that nobody should be disadvantaged, and nobody should be in a privileged position at the cost of another, that there should be fair play in society. We banter around words like equality and fair play, but it is with the premise of justice that we can see that being implemented in society. And COVID really did bring to light how we don't have a just society. And it really does depend on the postcode lottery.
Thank you very much,
Thank you.
Sabira Lakha. Appreciate your time with us. And thank you all for watching. That was Sabira Lakha, prospective parliamentary candidate for Harrow East. Goodbye.